Welcome back to the Titans of Foodservice Podcast. As always, thank you so much for joining me on another episode. Please, if you enjoy the podcast or if you enjoy this episode, if you could leave a 5-star review, whether you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast, if you could leave a 5-star review, that would truly mean the world. Today, I welcome Guy Rigby, and we're going to dive into the whole world of luxury hotels. He started at the Ritz Hotel early in his career. Then he eventually moved into the Four Seasons, becoming the vice president of food and beverage for the Americas. And his journey around the world, working in Houston and Tokyo and Bangkok and New York, it's a really fun story. So let's go ahead and jump right into it and welcome Guy. Guy, welcome to the Titans of Foodservice Podcast. I've been looking forward to our conversation. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to meet with me. And yeah, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure. Yeah, very nice to be to meet you and get this going.
Of course. So why don't I usually like to start off with just the basics of when I have guests come onto the show, how did you get into the food and beverage industry? What was your starting point?
Yeah, I once wanted to be a lawyer when I was at school, but I wasn't clever enough. How fortuitous was that? Because I've had a fun career bouncing around the world, and it's been very good to me. And so, no, actually, I did want to go to law school when I was in England, and I didn't get the grades. So instead of sort of redoing all my exams, sort of rethought my life. And my mother used to go, we lived in Worcestershire, and she used to go to this hotel school in Birmingham, in England, where they served the students and who were cooking and serving, offered a lunch for £3.50. And she would go with her friends, and they would have lunch, and they would go shopping. And so she said, and I was always hanging around the kitchen watching what she was doing. And I'd worked in a pub many years ago, just before that time, when I don't actually think I was legally allowed to drink, but I was tall, so I got away with it. And I really loved being behind the bar, and they knew that I had a good time that summer working for a friend's pub. So they put two and two together, and Mother said, why don't you consider the hotel business? And that's where it all started.
Wow. All right. When you got into the hotel business, what was your first stop?
Well, I was at hotel school in Cheltenham in England, and I was working at a hotel just, to earn beer money and pay rent at a hotel called the Greenway Hotel in Cheltenham. And it's a country house hotel, and the owner was a chap called Tony Elliott, and he took an interest in me, fortunately, and he drove me up to London one day and introduced me to all his chums in the hotel business. And the most important meeting was with Michael Duffel, who was then the managing director of the Ritz Hotel. And I was very nervous meeting him. He was an imposing chap running an imposing hotel. And he offered me a job as a receptionist, which I did for about a year. And then he promoted me to assistant food and beverage manager. And I worked for another mentor, a chap called Ralph Birnbaum, who was a German gentleman who'd come over to England right after the war, and got a job at the Savoy as a waiter, and worked his way up to head waiter at the Savoy. And one of the guys who was working as a server and a busboy under him, while he was head waiter, was this chap Michael Duffel, who was going through the Savoy training program. And Michael eventually became the managing director of the Ritz, and hired Ralph as his food and beverage manager. So I worked for Ralph, and he was, he's one of these old school guys. I was in at breakfast time, bailing the folks in room service out and making toast and setting trays up and putting butters on trays, making sure there were flowers there, and running trays up the elevator to the guest rooms. And then I was still there, at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, helping the head waiters of sort of private events and catching up with correspondence. So very, very long hours, because he was an old-fashioned kind of guy. But he taught me all the basics. Really, it was a great education.
I love that. When you were going through, can we actually take a step back? Hotel school. What is that? How do you get into that? I live in California, and I believe I've never heard of a hotel school. I've heard of people getting hospitality degrees at college, but what is a hotel school?
Well, it's the same thing, really. It's just the
Okay,
old-fashioned term, really, Nick. You've got Cornell offering a hospitality program, and I think in Europe, in the old days, they used to go to the Swiss hotel schools, and it's basically the same thing.
gotcha. And you mentioned a few people that were kind of mentors to you. What were some of the lessons that they taught you over the years?
Goodness, so many people taught me different things. So in the early days, Michael Duffel, who was the managing director of the Ritz, he'd sort of instilled in me, well, A, hard work, B, um, the whole essence of hospitality. Um, that the guest is there to be entertained, to be taken care of. We're there to provide that service for them. And the Ritz. It was a classic old-fashioned hotel where whatever the guest wanted, the guest received. Um, and for sure, we had some very difficult guests who we had to appease. Um, we were trying to create an exceptional product with the very best food, an extraordinary wine list, magnificent cocktail bar. Tea at the Ritz, of course, were legendary. It had to be absolutely perfect. I mean, every assistant manager in food and beverage runs around looking for teaspoons. I did the same. The teapots had to be warmed before we made the tea, and the milk had to be the right temperature, and the quality of the tea, and the amount of tea we put into the pot. All these things. It was details, details, details. So back in those days, it was all about quality and style. And then fast forward when I joined Four Seasons Hotels, which happened a short while later. That's when I really learned about leadership. Not only, excellence in service standards, but leadership and consistency. That was a whole different education altogether when I joined Four Seasons.
I'm sure. When you're at the Ritz, did they have systems and processes in place that ensured a consistent, high quality experience for the guests? Because I can only imagine, you kind of hinted at it, there would be some guests that are more difficult than others. And when people come to the Ritz, they expect a certain degree of quality and service. So what were some of the ways that you and your team were able to, be consistent?
Yeah, well, it was old school. You weren't allowed on the floor. You had to go through a couple of weeks of training as a server before you were allowed on the floor. Nowadays they're so short-staffed they would just get thrown into the fire. But we were very, very detail-oriented. Um, it was silver service in those days. It wasn't, you weren't bringing plates of food to the table. If you were doing a private event, you were approaching the table with a silver salver of a rack of lamb, or you would carve a Dover sole, to debone a Dover sole at the table. It was classic old-fashioned service in those days, and it had to be learned. And if mistakes were made, we would compensate the guests. It's as simple as that. And so we didn't want to do a lot of that. So we trained and trained and trained and overtrained new servers and new bartenders and new cooks in the kitchen until they had it absolutely right. So it was, and then there were written standards. We would bring new servers in, and we would send them home with pages and pages of standards, and then we would test them on them. It
Wow.
was simple, and if they didn't pass the test, you either had to come back a couple of days later having relearned the standards. But yeah, I mean, we would sit them down and give them a test, and they had to know, how many minutes they were allowed to a guest, how long it took them before they would serve their orange juice, and how many minutes it was before they were served their main course, and what temperature the butter needed to be served at, and what temperature the hot water needed to be when it was put into the tea in order to infuse the tea properly. So it was details, 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 and everybody had to learn that.
Yeah, I'm sure. When it came to the hiring process and bringing on new people, is there certain characteristics in people that you recognize that they can do this job or they cannot do this job?
Yeah, I mean, there's no surprise that we were looking for people with a great attitude. Certainly in those days, you weren't going to get into a job at a hotel like the Ritz unless you had a CV, as you say, a resume over here, a resume showing some previous experience in fine dining and really great quality restaurants. And because of the reputation of the Ritz, we weren't short of applicants in that respect. And then we would get a lot coming over from Europe as well. So, I remember the general manager of the restaurant, the Ritz restaurant, was a German gentleman who was extremely polished. The assistant general manager was French, and he was there for a long, long time. And they were just, they lived. That was their career. They lived to be restaurant managers. It wasn't a stepping stone to something else. That was their career. They were proud to be a restaurant manager. And when they opened the restaurant, it was like the start of a show at the West End or on Broadway. We did the pre-shift. Everybody went to their stations. We opened the doors and we waited for the guests to come in. I mean, it was literally like that. And the brigade were ready down in the kitchen, and they all had white toques on. And I mean, it sounds old-fashioned, but it was a little bit in those days. And but it made everybody sort of arch their back a little bit and stand with their shoulders straight. And here we go, guys.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. What about when it came to the food and beverage offerings there at the Ritz? How would you ensure that they aligned with the brands or with the Ritz's, luxury brand?
Yeah, so back in those days, there were, the Ritz in London had nothing to do with the Ritz-Carlton. There was the Ritz in Paris. There was the Ritz in, I think, in Madrid, and then the Ritz in London. So there were really only 3 Ritz hotels. The Ritz in Paris had been opened by Cesar Ritz, and then he built the Ritz in London. And he built that from ground up. Basically, the Ritz in Paris, as you know, was a conversion of some other buildings. So there weren't sort of corporate Ritz standards. There was the Ritz in London standard. Yeah. And the restaurant served French cuisine. I mean, that's all fine dining restaurants in those days were serving French cuisine, and we were doing the same. But, we had a chef when I was there, an entertaining chap called Michael Quinn, who was British, and he was a brilliant, brilliant chef, a very charismatic guy. And he was very good for PR as well. The guests loved him. He was a great conversationalist. But he grew up cooking French food, and so the menu at the Ritz restaurant was French cuisine.
Yeah, that makes sense. So going from the Ritz, and then you mentioned you moved over to the Four Seasons. Why did you make that move?
Well, there was a little in between. I'd opened a country house hotel down in Sussex. Okay. When I was in my mid-20s. I was the resident manager opening this hotel. That was an extraordinarily beautiful hotel, owned and operated, owned by a Canadian developer. And it won a lot of awards, and I would probably still be in the country house hotel business, but there was a huge hurricane in the south of England back in 1980, goodness me, I think 6. And it devastated our hotel. We lost so many trees. We had lost power. We lost telephone lines. And it was really a disaster. And then Michael Duffel, who I'd stayed in touch with, said, listen, dear boy, I'm going to go to the United States to open a hotel with Cunard. Cunard owned the Ritz in London. And why don't you come with me? You can't stay in small hotels for the rest of your life. You need to have an international hotel career. So that sounded appealing. So I followed him to Philadelphia, and we opened a hotel there called Hotel atop the Bellevue. But really, the best hotel in Philadelphia by far at the time was the Four Seasons. And so I discovered Four Seasons. I found out more about who they were, what they stood for, and I wanted to work for that company. So I applied, and the only job they had available at the time was food and beverage director down in Houston, Texas. I got the map out and had a look. Where's Houston? It's down there. And so I packed my bags and I joined Four Seasons in 1990 as food and beverage director in Houston.
Wow. What were the differences, if any, between the British experience in hotels versus the American one?
Um, yeah, so I'll talk immediately about Four Seasons because when I joined that company, I remember sitting in my very first morning briefing. There was a chap called Francisco Gomez who was the GM. And I was just astonished. They had every member of the executive committee. They had the department head who had been manager on duty over the weekend. They had the head housekeeper, chief engineer, director of rooms, front office manager. And we were all sitting listening to the report of the department head who'd been on duty over the weekend. And had never heard anything so detailed. That they would walk from the top of the building to the bottom of the building and record every chip of paint. This department head had children in the room. There were standards for children's, for how you set a room up for children. Every socket had to be plugged with a kid-friendly, whatever you call it, stopper, so that the kids don't poke their fingers in and become electrocuted. Kids' food had to be absolutely right on room service tray, etc., etc. To me, it was extraordinary. I walked away thinking, wow, these guys really get it. And a large part of the meeting was celebrating and recognizing certain employees who had gone above and beyond during that weekend. So I immediately got the sense that this company is really focused on their employees. Whereas, it's not as though that hadn't happened with other hotels that I'd worked for, but there was a huge focus on it at Four Seasons all of a sudden. This became very clear right away.
Sure.
And then the focus on the guests was extraordinary as well. Things, little glitches that had happened during the weekend, the things that the hotel did in order to rescue that the poor experience, rescue the hotel, make sure the guest was sort of showered with attention. The restaurant would make sure the front desk knew what had happened, so the front desk could mention this to the guest when they checked out. Oh, Mr. Rigby, we understood that your cocktails were a bit delayed when you sat down for dinner last night, and you mentioned to the restaurant, we're terribly sorry about that, and we hope the rest of your stay was enjoyable. Duty manager gets called, they apologize again. I think, whoa, these guys are on it. And so immediately I was sort of aware it's detail, detail, detail. These guys take care of the employees. If the employees aren't taking care of the guests, nobody else will. So let's make sure our employees are treated well, they're encouraged, they're motivated, they're recognized. It was full circle. The whole thing made a lot of sense to me. And the standards. And I got into it. I said, yeah, this is the way it should be.
I love that. At the time when you went down to Houston, how long had that property been in operation before you arrived?
I have to double check. I think about 10 years.
And you mentioned that you had opened a location prior to this. What was that experience like, kind of going from the ground up?
Yeah. So I'd opened a hotel in Sussex in England.
Yeah.
and it was a 21-room luxury country house hotel. Similar in a way to the Greenway, where I'd started my hotel career when I was at hotel school. But yeah, this was, I didn't have standards then. I was writing all the standards. I was training every employee. I never worked as hard in my life. Yeah, it was hard work, and we made a lot of mistakes. But I had a very, very good assistant manager. His name was Caroline, and she'd come from a very well-known hotel in the south of England called the Gravetime Manor. And people who have experienced in the UK will have heard of that hotel. And fortunately, she really took over the front desk, reservations, and sort of guest services. And I focused on obviously the food and beverage side, and I was sort of resident manager. But it was lead by example. I hired people and they had to follow me. Caroline would hire people on the front desk. They would follow her. We were writing standards as we were going. Yeah, that's not the way to open a hotel. That was hard work.
Yeah, I'm sure. And then when you're at the Four Seasons, what was your day-to-day life like at that point?
Yeah, it became very structured. You would... I'm an early riser, so I enjoy getting up early and walking the hotel. But, you would start with your morning briefing. I would always be wandering around the restaurant at breakfast, wandering around housekeeping, checking on... there would be a sort of early morning pre-shift for the housekeeping staff, which was fun to attend. And then would be the daily briefing, and you would discuss arrivals for the day and problems and glitches from the day before. So there was a lot of structure, a lot more structure than I'd ever had previously, and it was a fantastic training. And as Four Seasons are renowned for their training, and as a food and beverage director going in, there was a very detailed and structured training program, so that I was spending time with each department head, each division head. They were explaining what they were doing to me. The general manager was very generous of his time. He stayed very close to me as I was sort of new to Four Seasons and new to that role. So it became very clear that there was a structure to everything, and
Sure.
so I felt secure, but I also knew that I was surrounded by really exceptional people. And not that I hadn't before, but these people were exceptional in so many different levels. They were exceptional in the way that they treated their staff. They were exceptional in business. They were exceptional in following up on service standards. They were exceptional in the way that they dealt with the guests directly. And so I've always wanted to surround myself by people who are better than me, because it's forced me to learn. Unfortunately, in Four Seasons, that was not difficult, because that company is full of very brilliant people. And so all the bosses I ever had were vastly better than I ever was, and ever will be. So it was just joyful for me to learn from these guys, from these people. And obviously with a leader like Izzy Sharp, someone who was so extraordinarily humble yet so brilliant in the things that he was doing and the culture he created for the company. Those of us who were lucky enough to work in that company had a mentor, had someone who was visionary and who we could look up to. And so yeah, it was a turning point in my career, and I spent 26 years with that company.
Wow. And Izzy Sharp, I'm not familiar with him. Who is he?
Oh, he's the founder of Four
Wow.
Seasons Hotels. Yeah. And
Wow.
he's still the chairman of the company in his 90s. And, he was an extraordinary individual. And, it wasn't just about opening great hotels that had fantastic services. It became very clear to him early on that Four Seasons had to have a very, very strong employee culture. And it was his vision to create this employee culture. And if you didn't get on board with it, you really didn't have a job with Four Seasons. It's as simple as that. And I always joke with people, you could, if you were a GM in the company, you would miss your operating profit, your budgeted operating profit 2 or 3 years in a row. They'd send someone from home office to help you out. But if you missed on your employee culture, and we would have management opinion surveys and employee opinion surveys, but if you were missing on that for 3 years in a row, you were looking for another job. It was as simple as that. So the employee culture was sacred. It was how we treated our people. It's the famous golden rule. We treated people the way we want to be treated ourselves, and everybody had to buy into that. And it's not a difficult thing to buy into. I mean, it makes so much sense. And when you're surrounded by so many people who, well, everybody, they all get it. We all bought into the same thing. We all wanted to take care of our employees and our guests in that way. So it was a good thing.
Yeah, that's refreshing to hear. My dad and I, we started our own food service sales and marketing company back in 2015. And as we've grown, we started to do kind of similar to what you were mentioning is employee assessments, where they grade us on tons of different metrics, from compensation to innovation to company culture. And it was really eye-opening to see and read what people say about the company as a whole. Are they happy here? Do they like the direction of the company? Because they're all thinking it in one way or another, and it's on the leadership team to take the time to actually listen to what they have to say.
Yeah.
So that's very important within a business to be successful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Were other people working at the Four Seasons, were they from all over the globe as well, or was let's take all over? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so I went from Houston to Tokyo, from Tokyo to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Toronto, Toronto to Bangkok, Bangkok to Vancouver, to New York, to Vancouver, and then back to Toronto. So, and that's relatively common, Four Seasons is a global hotel company, and they needed people with global experience, and the guests are from all over the world as well. So it was always an advantage if you had experience in Asia and Europe and the Middle East and South America, and it was always a huge advantage. So that we were putting programs together that were perfect for different cultures.
When you were in Bangkok versus Houston, what was the differences between the two within the Four Seasons?
Wow.
Well, I'm sure there's probably many.
Yeah. So, the Thai culture is just so wonderful. The people are just so gracious. You could go and stay in a 3-star hotel in Thailand, and because of the way that you're treated, you'd think you're in a 5-star hotel, because it's just naturally in them to treat you with grace and dignity and humility. They'll do anything for you, the Thai people. They're absolutely wonderful, wonderful people. I had a fantastic time there. And they're all incredibly keen. There are no egos there. They all want to help each other out. And that was so refreshing as well.
Sure.
I remember we traveled, I was in Bangkok as GM, and we traveled to Paris. And, I absolutely love Paris. I love the French, but, sometimes they have a reputation of being in the hotel and restaurant business, a little bit snobby. And we checked in at the Georges V, and we'd overnight flight, so we were very early. And it was a very busy time. The room wasn't quite ready. So we went to the restaurant, and we were just waiting for them to get a table ready for us to sit. And I started a conversation with the hostess on the door. And she found out my name, quickly realized, having looked at the arrivals, that I was with Four Seasons. And she said, Monsieur Rigby, I want to tell you I was with the hotel since the opening, and I've worked in some other hotels in Paris, but, oh, Monsieur Rigby, Four Seasons is so different. Here, it's fantastic for everybody to love what they do. Nobody is a snob. Nobody is looking down on anybody. This is a culture I want to work with. This is fantastic. And she was so complimentary about, I think, the difference between the Four Seasons culture in a place like Paris and maybe the sort of old-fashioned traditional way that it's not everywhere in Paris, but there are some places where it's a little bit old-fashioned. It was definitely like that when I was at the Ritz, for goodness sake, in the old days, because we had a European stage system, and it was a little bit like that. But when I went to Thailand, there was none of that whatsoever. It's very easy to train people. They'll jump through hoops for you. And they're very, very focused on creating extraordinary product. I mean, they don't want anything to be ordinary there. They want everything to be extraordinary. It's an amazing country, amazing Thailand. And the restaurant scene in Bangkok is just fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you can get anything, food, wine, cocktails, you can get anything there. And they deliver time and time again. So I was fortunate to work there and had some great people working there as well, who I was very, very lucky to partner with in that hotel. Goodness me, Jim Fitzgibbon was the president of Asia Pacific at the time. Such an extraordinary guy, one of the great, great leaders of Four Seasons. Goodness, Max Musto was our Italian restaurant manager. He's now in Florence as general manager of Four Seasons still. Goodness, so many people. It was just a fantastic team then. Randy Shimabuku, goodness me, he's, where's Randy now? One of the great people managers of my life. I learned so much from him. I could go on and on, but just fantastic people working there.
Yeah. Would you build a relationship with guests in their time there? Like, would they have access to you outside of the hotel?
Well, yes. I mean, when you become the general manager, you have to sort of relate to them, I think. And occasionally you're going to invite them for lunch or for dinner. But you've got a busy job to do. You can't spend a lot of time hanging out with every guest. I mean, you got hotels of 200 or 300 guest rooms, so you've got a lot of very important guests there. So we've got VIPs, we've got special attention guests. So yeah, there are certain people who, for various different reasons, require a little bit more attention. But our job was to take care of everybody in the same way.
What about around discretion? I would imagine there's probably some very high net worth individuals, celebrities coming into these properties. How would the Four Seasons ensure that these people are, safe and can come in here, not be interrupted by outside noises?
Yep. It's part of our culture, and it's part of the standards that you're taught during orientation. And you just simply don't break it. I'm still unpopular with my children for many, many reasons, but one of the reasons was we were dining at Four Seasons Los Angeles once, and Roger Federer was sitting across the restaurant, and they were into tennis at the time, and they wanted to go and get his autograph. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I said, oh, Dad. So I said, nope, I got to set an example, same as everybody else. So it's just consistency, maintaining that standard all the time.
Sure. So you were the general manager, and then what was kind of the next step from there?
Yeah, so I'd been in Vancouver, and it was a slightly older property, and Four Seasons had the lease of that property, and we renovated the restaurant. And the guy who had been senior vice president of food and beverage, who had put Four Seasons, or put food and beverage on the map, really, for Four Seasons, a wonderful, wonderful man called Alphonse Conrad. He had retired, so there was sort of no oversight in food and beverage, and we were creating a restaurant in Vancouver, and we're pretty much surrounded by water, and so seafood was the number one request for people going to the concierge, so we created a seafood restaurant. And Izzy Sharp had invited a restaurant designer called Jennifer Johansson, whose company was called EDG from San Francisco.
Okay.
And they did the interior design. I worked with Jennifer, and she is absolutely brilliant. They design restaurants that are relevant, that are for today's guest. And they understand the flow of a restaurant. They understand how a restaurant should make you feel. They understand how to put drama into a restaurant. So I learned so much from working with Jennifer and her colleagues. And we created a restaurant that fortunately was popular, and it was very successful. And so Jim Fitzgibbon called me one day and said, we'd like to actually, my boss at the time, Chris Hart, called me, who another chap I'd walk off a cliff for, fantastic man. And he called me and said, well, we have a job for you in Toronto. We'd like you to consider coming to Toronto as to head up the Americas as head of food and beverage, so North and South America. And there were two other colleagues, a chap called Giovanni Denti, who did Europe and the Middle East, and another chap, Brett Patterson, who did Asia Pacific. And so we became a team, and the whole gig at the time was sort of taking food and beverage from sort of continental dining rooms that had been very, I suppose, fashionable in hotels. The restaurant was a sort of extension of the design of the lobby, and again, it was serving formal cuisine, and you could get anything you wanted in the restaurant. And many of our restaurants, unfortunately, weren't that busy. They didn't have a great local following. Some of them were fantastic, but they didn't have a great local following. I'm super passionate about restaurants, and I wanted all of the restaurants to be really relevant. I wanted them to be fun. I wanted them to be busy. I wanted them to be connected to the community. I wanted them to serve fantastic food and have a great beverage list. And obviously, most importantly, I wanted them to make money and be successful. And so that really became our mission statement, that all the restaurants had to be relevant, fun, busy, connected to the community, serve great food, but most of all be profitable. And so we sat out on a mission. We worked with a lot of third-party restaurant operators, the Michael Minas of the world, the Daniel Boulous of the world, and so on. And we learned a lot by working with them. I mean, that's what their whole life was creating successful restaurants. So we continued to learn from them. And we just continued to chip away. And every time we had a new hotel, we would bring in a separate designer for the restaurant, because the architect and the interior designer for the guest rooms may not necessarily have been a specialist in restaurants. And if that was the case, we bring in a specialist restaurant designer, and it would be concept driven. So we would start with a concept, and we would design around the concept, and we would hire cooks to support the concept and general managers to support the concept. So we were creating independent freestanding restaurants that just happened to be in our hotels. And that was really, for us, a huge shift. And it takes time, right? Because every hotel has already got an established restaurant. And so we were working on new builds. We were working on existing hotels as and when the owners saw fit to support a renovation. We would work with the owners, and we would have to sell them on whatever concept we felt was right at that time in that destination, in that city, or in that resort. And so that's how that whole mood. And then, cocktail and mixology became huge, and every restaurant needed to have a really vibrant bar. In the good old days, 30 years ago, you would have a separate bar and a separate restaurant. And so nowadays you can't find a restaurant that doesn't have a great bar in it. So all those things were changes, and we had to get on board and make it happen.
Fascinating. Yeah. I'm just curious, were the Four Seasons, are they all corporately owned, or is it franchise owned? How's that structured?
No, it's the Four Seasons is a management company.
Okay.
And the Four Seasons don't own any of their properties.
Oh, they're in property. Okay, got it. Okay, that makes sense. And how many properties were you overseeing in this current role or in that role?
About 45 altogether in North and South America. And, we would typically have, I don't know, between 4 and 6 openings a year in the Americas. And then we'd have another, I don't know, 10 or 15 hotels either under consideration or under development. So I was on an airplane a lot.
I can imagine. And how would you ensure that the food and beverage offerings were connected to the community for each one of the properties?
Yeah, yeah. It just became one of the core values for us in food and beverage. We just needed to make sure that the restaurant was supporting the community, that we were our target guest was the local guest. If we got the locals right, the hotel guest would want to come and dine where the locals are eating. Right. So if you're staying in a hotel, you go to the concierge or you're looking up on your computer or your phone, your internet, what are the best local restaurants? And we wanted to be listed in those local restaurants. So, yeah, we had to reach out to the local community and we needed to bring them into our restaurant. So, everything that we were doing in terms of merchandising, marketing, social media, um, um, you know, um, any local charity that needed to be supported. We wanted to be there. We wanted to show them that we were offering our services to cook at an event or whatever else. So, yeah, there was so many different things that we were doing, but it became part of our DNA was we had to be in the community. That was terribly important to us.
Sure. And of the 45 locations, you may not want to admit it or say it out loud, but which concept do you think would be your favorite?
Oh goodness, no! That's like which is my favorite child. We did some fantastic concepts with some fantastic. I would. It's just impossible to say. We were very very lucky to have incredibly supportive owners. Um, we had amazing people of our own. I mean, we worked with some great third party operators as well, but the people, the chefs that we had, the restaurant managers, the sommeliers, the bartenders. I mean, they had so much passion, and the
Sure.
food and beverage directors. They worked so hard. They studied. They went out to eat. Whenever I would visit a hotel, we would always go out. We'd eat in 2 or 3 restaurants a night, looking at what was happening in the busiest and the best. Right. The GM would come, the F&B director, the chef. We would all go out, the catering director, and we would just soak it all up. What are they doing? And how can we do this as well as they are doing it? And so we did it. We did some really, really cool and fun concepts, and it wasn't always just about steakhouse here, Italian there, Japanese there. Sometimes it was about a chef-led concept, but we just added layers of drama to the experience. So the guest was coming in, and from a design perspective, oh wow, look at this! This is extraordinary. And then they would look at the beverage menu, and I remember when we opened the restaurant in Vancouver in it was called Yew. It's another story altogether. But we said to the restaurant manager, I said to him, because I'd learned this from one of the corporate guys that was helping to open the restaurant with us, John Washko, another fantastic guy. And John had said, hey, when you open the restaurant, I saw this really cool thing once. He said, why don't you offer any bottle on the wine list? You'll open any bottle on the wine list by the glass. They just have to buy 2 glasses. And if it's a 6-ounce pour, that's basically half the bottle gone. All right. And back in those days, you had, the vacuum program. So you sucked all the air out of the bottle and it would last for a couple of weeks. And then people would come in and they would see this amazing wine by the glass program with some really big bottles that had been opened and they were available by the glass. Now you've got the Coravin system, so it's even better. So, we were doing cool things like that. And again, I was surround yourself by the best people and just learn from them. And then if they suggest something, just do it better. Not do it better, just try and do it as well and make sure it's consistently done day in, day out, so that you never drop a beat.
Sure. And Guy, what are you working on here now in present day?
Well, I'm fortunate to be working actually with the Raffles Hotel Group. They're opening up a new hotel in Boston, and that's the first time Raffles have come to North America, and that's a very, very exciting project with a big food and beverage operation. So we expect to open that hotel in August of this year. Got a fantastic GM there and a great F&B team. Chef is a chap called George Mendes, who had a Michelin star for his restaurant Aldea in New York. But he grew up in New England, and he's from Portugal, and so we're doing a Portuguese restaurant there. I just had a 2-week vacation in Portugal, which was amazing. So I have a client that I've been working with down in Virginia, a lovely country house hotel called the George's Inn in Lexington, Virginia. And I've been the consultant to the owner of sort of asset managing that property for about 6 years now. And it's a very charming country inn, 33 guest rooms, and the guest rooms are in 4 different buildings, and we've got a sort of upscale pub, and we've got a very, very lovely restaurant with a French chef. Actually, he doesn't do French cuisine, but he's a French chef, and he used to work at Truffles Restaurant at Four Seasons Toronto many, many, many years ago. And he's a super guy, Xavier Deshay. So I've been working with them, asset managing that property. And I do work. I've been doing some work for clubs here in Toronto, helping them sort of understand and figure out their food and beverage, how to become a bit more profitable, how to increase the service programs to their guests. All sorts of different things pop up all the time. It's fantastic to be in a consulting role and be able to sort of turn your hand to different things. One minute I'm helping open a luxury branded hotel in Boston. Next minute I'm working on in a luxury 33-room boutique hotel in Virginia. Next minute I'm working with a golf club, and so it's a very different job to what I used to be doing. I certainly miss those days with Four Seasons, but I was on an airplane an awful lot. I didn't have as much time with my kids watching them grow up, and so I was fortunate at that time to be able to make that switch.
Yeah, that makes sense. Looking back on your career, would you have done anything differently?
No. As I said at the beginning of this chat, I had originally wanted to be a lawyer, and that's because the old-fashioned sort of Harry Potter style school that I went to said, well, you're going to go into the law, or you're going to become a doctor, or you're going to go to the army or the navy or the air force, and the hotel business was not on the list. I thought, well, I was good at debating. All right. So I was the captain of the debating society back in those days. And I thought, well, let's try this. It's sort of akin to being a lawyer. But that, as I say, you had to pass a lot of exams to do that. And I wasn't terribly good at passing exams. So as a very dear friend of mine, he was the banquet manager at the Pierre in New York, Paul Nikai, such an amazing gentleman, a great sense of humor. And Paul said to me once, we've done all right serving chicken for a living, haven't we? He said, it's a bit of a euphemism. It's a bit of a euphemism, but it's actually pretty true. We've been fortunate to take care of people. So my father was a doctor. My mother was a midwife. 2 professions that are a much higher calling, in my opinion, than being in the hotel business. And you actually really do have to be very smart to be the sort of doctor that my dad was. He was incredibly clever. And my mother was the kindest person in the world. And so I'm always considered myself to be very lucky that my job has been um, to take care of wonderful employees who you just you get to know them and you love them, and they're going out on the front line and taking care of your guests. And then most of the time, the guests are turning around saying, well, we love you. We've had a wonderful experience. We had a great party. We had a great dinner. We had a great stay at the hotel. Thank you very much indeed. What a great life.
Yeah.
And then and I've bounced around the world from England to Texas to Tokyo to Toronto to Bangkok to New York to Vancouver to all over the world. And friends in different cultures and different places. And then, in the food and beverage role, going to so many different cities and so many different areas of North and South America. And I'm truly blessed to have done what I've done, and I'm still loving every second of it. So it's not a job for folks who want weekends off and they don't want to work in the evenings. You've got to be committed and you've got to be in it. If you don't love it, you're not passionate about it, don't do it, because you won't be successful if you're just not loving every second of it.
Sure.
But luckily, I loved it.
What advice would you give to a smart, driven student coming out of school who wants to be like you one day?
I've sort of said this just in the last sentence. You've got to be passionate.
Yeah.
If you're passionate about something, then you'll study it. It's like if you're the best golfer in the world, you're playing golf every day, and you're taking golf lessons, and you're improving every part of your golf swing. And if you want to work with an amazing organization like Four Seasons or Mandarin or Peninsula or Fairmont or Raffles or Ritz-Carlton, any of these amazing brands, right? Then you've got to hone your skills so your skills are better than somebody else's. But I think the most critical thing, and it was taught to me by Four Seasons, was take care of your people. If you know how to be a great leader, and you know how to get the best out of your people, and you can inspire them, then I think you can do anything, right? Because you surround yourself with great people. Make sure that you're doing something that you're passionate about. You've got to be passionate about the hotel and restaurant business. And it could be in marketing, it could be in food and beverage, or it could be in the guest room side, it could be in engineering, or finance. There are so many different arms to the hotel business, and they're all equally as essential as one another. And if you're passionate about that, you're passionate about people, and you surround yourself by people who are smarter than you, then and you've got a little bit of luck along the way, then you can have a great career.
Well, Guy, I want to say thank you so much for coming on to the Titans of Foodservice podcast and sharing your story. And I know there's going to be a lot of people out there that resonate with this. So thank you. And I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing all about your life. I really enjoyed our conversation. And so thank you.
Great pleasure, Nick. I'm delighted to share that with you. So thank you.